There have been two massive developments regarding the Europe-wide but even the worldwide energy crisis, and these will have huge consequences without a doubt, not only for the people of America and Europe, but actually the entire world as well. Now this is of course on top of an already incredibly turbulent year, with energy prices skyrocketing through the roof already, thousands of businesses predicted to go bankrupt, and millions of families about to suffer and go cold this winter. It seems though that the situation just keeps getting worse. The real problem here though is that there just isn't an easy fix. There isn't really any way around these troubles. Today we're going to go over these two brand new developments, what they are, how they work, and why so many people are screaming that the sky is falling. Now, the first development is regarding natural gas imports from Russia into Germany and then the rest of Europe as well. Now, most of this gas flows through these massive undersea pipelines that you can see behind me on this article called Nord Stream 1. And this gas supplies other countries other than Germany as well, even though that's where the pipeline goes. Now, this is such a ridiculously important pipeline that over the last decade, a second one has begun to be built called Nord Stream 2. It is though incredibly controversial and would actually increase the amount of natural gas that Germany could import from Russia, which would lower prices in the short run, but it would also make Germany and the rest of Europe more dependent on Russian natural gas. Now, it's for this reason mostly that NS2 has been opposed by so many different peoples and groups because they're worried about Russia's intentions, and rightly so. Germany, though, had just ignored that risks for years and they didn't really seem to care. They wanted that cheap Russian gas and they lost all morality. Once the invasion of Ukraine started, though, and Russian threats against the rest of Europe started to flood in, Germany realized its mistake, but all was already too late. Nord Stream 2 was basically completed and ready to go, but it was never turned on and it's now been cancelled indefinitely. But of course the damage has already been done because Germany is already massively dependent on Russian gas through Nord Stream 1. Now, Russia know this, of course, and they've played their cards extremely well when it comes to Europe's energy dependency. They know that expensive energy will cripple Germany's economy, and so limiting supply of gas through NS1 keeps supply tight, and that keeps prices high. This has now been happening for months now, with maintenance issues or gas leaks or a bunch of other excuses coming out to play. The capacity for the pipeline was taken down from 100% at first down to 60%, then to 40%, and then last week down to 20%, which is where we were sitting. The new development, though, is that last week, Russia announced that Nord Stream 1 was going to shut down entirely. It was going to go down to 0% capacity, and they claimed it was for some run-of-the-mill maintenance on a turbine that was essential to the functioning of the pipeline, and they also claimed that come yesterday, it would all be turned back on. Here's the massive problem we're seeing today, though. It didn't turn back on. Gazprom, which is a massive Russian natural gas company and basically owns and runs Nord Stream 1, said that a technical issue had been found and the pipeline can't operate until it's been fixed. Now, everyone and their mum knows that this is nonsense. Russia has been doing this for months on end now, but it doesn't really matter what the real reason for this closure is. The fact is that there will be no more gas coming into Europe from Nord Stream 1 anymore. Now, this has been perfectly timed by Russia for a couple different reasons, so it isn't really too surprising to see them take this action. Now, the first reason is that Europe has been buying more and more gas than it actually needs over recent months, building up supply and storing it, anticipating that in the winter, when gas is really essential for people to heat their homes, Russia will cut off gas all entirely, and so that will cause an awful lot of damage. This plan is basically to try and limit that damage, and the EU set a target of 80% of their gas reserves built up by November, but they beat that target and they met it last week. Now, the larger the EU's reserves, the less Russia can actually impact the EU over the next year, so Russia cutting off all supply right now is calculated. They don't want those reserves getting any larger, and Russia is probably quite surprised and annoyed that the EU has actually managed to do something quickly and efficiently for once in its life. Now, the second reason this is so well timed is because Russia has been slowly adding up pressure onto the supply of gas over the entirety of 2022, but in particular since the invasion of Ukraine. As a result, prices of natural gas have been continually rising as well, and they weren't just a singular spike when the invasion happened and then a slow decline afterwards. Now, as earlier discussed, Russia wants to keep prices as high as possible for two reasons: to inflict as much pain on Europe as possible, but also to make as much money as possible for Russia itself. The problem for Russia, though, is that a couple of weeks ago, gas prices reached their brand new highs, but that was only a spike, and so prices started to fall again, and it got to the point where they actually fell 21% from that high. Russia wants to maintain these rising prices, so cutting the supply further provides more supply pressures and will cause the price of natural gas to rise further. As I said, this has been perfectly timed by Russia. Now, that is the first massive development that we're talking about, which is going to have huge impacts on the energy security of Europe and the rest of the world, but it isn't the only one. The other really big development is that the G7, which is a group of 7 countries, the US, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and then also kind of the EU too, well, they're all allies and they're all opposed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine for obvious reasons. Now, they put together a proposal led by the US to try and limit Russia's oil revenues to stop them from profiting too much from these high oil prices. Now, this price cap on Russian exports has taken months to get here, but it has finally been agreed, at least for the most part. Of course, the EU still has to ask all 27 of its members to implement it and to vote for it, and Hungary and a couple of other countries might just outright reject it. It's also unlikely that we'll see some other countries like India or China back the plan, and many other countries too, because they like their Russian oil and they don't want to damage their relations with Russia, because then they would lose access. It's also worth noting that these countries are already getting super cheap Russian oil, so they don't really need a price cap. The Indonesian government came out a few months ago and told the world that actually Russia was selling them oil at a 30% discount to market rates. Now, with that being said, this plan is still probably going to go into effect for the G7 and for most of the EU as well. Now, this should be good news though, right? Of course, there is a big problem, and that problem is that Russia doesn't like this plan. They came out and said that any country which sets up an oil price cap for their oil will get zero oil exported to them at all. Now, the issue here should be clear. This will create supply shocks for those countries and reduce the potential supply of oil for them, and so it will send prices higher and cause even more problems for these countries. The truth is, though, this is actually a really hard thing to predict how it will play out, because Russia has used very similar threats like this in the past over the last year, and in the end, they had no teeth. About 6 months ago, back when the ruble was in loads of trouble, Russia demanded that all gas repayments were to be made in rubles to try and prop up their currency. Most of members of the EU, of course, said no, they're not going to do that, they won't pay for their gas in rubles, and Russia said that if they don't do that, then they wouldn't be able to buy any gas at all. Of course, that caused gas prices to spike for a moment and lots of people got very worried, but in the end, Russia silently backed down because they didn't want to stop selling that gas to Europe and stop raking in those profits. We are now in a very similar situation in regards to this oil price cap, and Russia is using the identical threat they used before. My gut simply says that Russia probably won't follow through with this because they still want and need those oil sales, and they're already having to sell to other third-party countries like Indonesia for a 30% discount, and if they stop selling to the West, that discount is only going to have to get larger. There is, though, one other massive problem here, and that's the fact that price controls very rarely work. Capitalism, plain and simple, is the most powerful force in the world because it's actually millions of individual forces working in conjunction with each other. When governments get involved and try to force prices in one direction, that always leads to problems of one kind or another. The best example of this is rent controls in cities like Berlin, which have been absolutely disastrous. Yes, they have kept rents low for some certain people who are lucky enough to have an apartment, but it's resulted in massive misallocation of resources. There is no new housing being built in these cities, and so millions of people can't find any place to rent at all, and the policy has been an absolute total failure. It's actually very likely that we see similar failures when we see this oil price cap implemented because it's just very difficult to get them right. We could simply see Russia refuse to sell at anything but the market rates to the West and result in supply shortages all over the place. Or we could also see this lead to the weaponization of the oil market like Russia has already done with the gas markets as well. I do feel the need to mention, though, that this isn't just a problem for the West. There are also massive problems at stake here for Russia. Oil production is very difficult to shut down and then start back up. We saw back when the Soviet Union fell apart, the oil production fell from about 10 million barrels a day down to 6 million barrels, and it took those countries 20 years to get back up to that 10 million barrel a day mark. If Russia stops selling oil in response to this price cap, the storage facilities for oil in Russia would quickly rise and they would have to stop production at some point, and that could be absolutely disastrous. There's another massive problem though surrounding Russian oil, and that's that new sanctions have yet to come into effect, but they will come in soon, and they relate to insurance for oil tankers with Russian oil. It could basically make it near impossible to get insurance for an oil tanker carrying Russian oil and result in Russia not being able to export oil at all. This would again result in reservoirs filling up with oil and production having to be shut down, which would have decade-long consequences for Russia. It seems that everyone's instinct these days with Russia is to assume that Europe is on the brink of collapse while Russia is sitting pretty with no issues at all. And to be clear, I do think that Europe is getting absolutely hammered here and in total dismay and in serious trouble. But the very same is clearly true for Russia as well, despite what the shills will tell you here on YouTube. It is incredibly difficult for Russia to sell gas to other countries outside of Europe, and stopping all sales to the EU will result in no revenues at all, which Russia desperately needs. Russia is also already being forced to sell oil at massively lower prices and huge discounts to market rates, and if it has to actually take concrete steps to reduce its production, then those effects will last for decades. The big counter-argument seems to basically be that the Russian ruble is super strong right now, but under the surface, the ruble markets are severely limited and all is not so well. That tends to be the main point by people who don't really understand foreign exchanges and currency rates, and that they're always a double-edged sword, and that a strong currency isn't necessarily a better one. Everyone knows how China intentionally tries to keep its currency weak, but the second someone says that maybe the Russian ruble being strong isn't a good thing, people lose their minds. Honestly though, that's a topic for another day. As for now, the energy crisis is continuing on and it's actually about to enter a new phase with no end in sight. The war in Ukraine is continuing as well, albeit with new vigor from Ukraine regarding this offensive in Kherson. The chances are that this war is not going to end anytime soon in my opinion, and as a result, the energy crisis isn't going to end anytime soon either.